Good morning, folks. I hope you've all had a terrific week. Thank you very much for tuning in to the news at Ben. Now, before I talk about the news items I wish to talk about, which, by the way, is going to be mostly on foreign policy, I think, this week, because there have been some really good news stories on the foreign policy front, I just want to mention my little Union flag that accompanies me on my various, actually all my media appearances, including the news at Ben, that I do from my home. And I've had a couple of texts this week saying, Ben, you know, when you do these presentations, particularly the news at Ben, what you want is two massive Union flags, one on each side, and have an air of seniority and political potency as you make these little speeches. And I think whilst it would be great to have that kind of prime ministerial look, presidential look, I don't think it's appropriate for these little chats. And I'm very attached to my Union flag sitting on my drinks trolley, which accompanied me, as some of you will know, through my time in the European Parliament. So my little Union flag and I will continue to deliver these messages together until greater things beckon, if they ever do beckon. The good news story that I want to focus on this morning is peace in the Middle East. The ceasefire that's been brought about between Israel and Gaza. And some may be wondering how it is that Trump is laying claim to having brought about that peace. But there's no doubt in my mind that it is Trump that's done it. First of all, we've got to go back to the original Trump presidency in 2016 to 2020 to remember that Trump was always for peace. He was, I think, one of the rare recent American presidents who didn't start a war during his presidency. And in the lead up to the election in November, and even after the election in November, he's been talking about bringing peace both to Ukraine and the Middle East. And he's done it in the case of Israel and Gaza, and it is him. And you may be wondering how the devil it is that he's done it. And I think it's pretty straightforward. I imagine the deal that's been agreed, this tentative peace while hostages are released and Palestinian prisoners are released from Israel. I'm sure that this deal has been on the table for quite some time. It's just that the Israelis didn't want to accept it, because what this deal doesn't deliver is the complete elimination of Hamas. And Benjamin Netanyahu and the more hawkish elements of his government and coalition wanted, I think, the complete elimination of Hamas before they agreed any peace deal for Gaza. But I think it's terrific that this deal has taken place, and I hope it holds. There's a 6-week period during which it will unfold and prisoners are exchanged for hostages, and then further arrangements are made. So it could break down, but I do hope it holds. And the thing that I hope comes next as well is a reconstruction of Gaza. And I say that with all our interests in mind. It's not about wanting, as I do in any event, the prosperity of Palestinians in Gaza. It's just that unless you have prosperity for Palestinians in Gaza, you will have a resurgence of Hamas. Hamas trades, like all terrorist groups, all destabilizing forces in the world, they prey on the insecurities, the frailties, and the penury of people, the absence of hope in peoples. That's what terrorists prey on. That's how they garner support, by painting a very bleak picture for those from whom they're seeking support, so that they can promote their extreme ideologies. And the best way to neuter Hamas, not having completely destroyed it during the war, the best way to neuter Hamas is to make Palestine, or Gaza rather, as prosperous as we can under the protection of the United States and Western powers, making sure that as that reconstruction takes place, Hamas cannot resume power. So it's not good enough, I think, for us to be patting ourselves on the back, or for Trump to be, understandably perhaps, patting himself on the back, thinking he's brought about peace. We've got to go that next step. We've got to have a vision of settlement now in the Gaza Strip. We didn't do this in Iraq properly. We didn't do it in Afghanistan properly. We abjectly failed to do it in Libya after we stirred up trouble there. And as a result, we've had decades of problems. So let's not make the same mistake in Gaza. Let's have some joined up thinking about what needs to come next. And I think the other mention I think worth making when we're talking about Gaza is the amazing work done, whether or not you like him, by Benjamin Netanyahu and Israel in pushing back the forces of terrorism over the last 18 months, 14 to 18 months that this war has been in existence. You know, during that period, Israel has done huge damage to Hamas. It hasn't eliminated it, but it's done huge damage. It's basically neutered Hezbollah in Lebanon. As a result of neutering Hezbollah, it's put Iran completely on its back foot because its proxies now, its key proxy, Hezbollah, and its other proxy, Hamas, are so weakened. And it's only as a result of the weakening of Iran that Assad fell. I know we've got an equally dodgy regime in charge of Syria, but Assad has fallen, and that is a symptom of Iran's waning power in the region. And of course, Israel has also attacked the Houthi rebels who caused so much trouble for trade routes for the West. So all in all, actually, the West has a debt of gratitude to Netanyahu. You won't hear many people say that. When I say you won't hear many people say that, you won't hear many people in office saying that, because most people in Europe are pro-Palestinian and anti-Israeli. But the fact is, we do have a debt of gratitude to Israel for cleaning up a lot of mess in the Middle East before this peace has now broken out, for which I am very grateful to President Trump and absolutely delighted. And I really hope we can now build on that peace for the prosperity of the region. And I think what follows from that, from a foreign policy perspective, is what else Trump might be able to do for peace in the world. And he's got one great vehicle through which he can deliver change, at least in Europe, and that is NATO. NATO, I think, was a great idea after World War II, and it's performed a fantastic function keeping peace in Europe. But it's recently really gone a bit wayward, partly because member states aren't coughing up and making their military strong enough to be worthy of their membership of NATO, but also because NATO has been slightly hijacked by a European agenda. No doubt NATO was a contributory cause of the war in Ukraine. It was the EU's befriending of Ukraine, the attempts by the EU to turn Ukraine's head away from looking towards Russia as its economic partner towards the EU, its desire to join the EU, the aid that was being offered by the EU, and the suggestion by NATO that it would place NATO bases in Ukraine that prompted that war. And Trump has already shaken NATO to some extent by saying that he wants member states to contribute up to 5% of GDP towards their military in order to continue that alliance. But I think he can go further. I think he can make NATO a conduit to really settling Europe. And this is how I think he can do it. First and foremost, I think he must make the EU give up any aspirations for a European defence union. That would stand in opposition to NATO. We do not want Brussels being in charge of a military force in Europe. It already has the trappings of a militia in Frontex, which is a EU-badged militia, as I say, that is charged with the responsibility of the protecting of European borders. So you've actually got EU militia-badged individuals in member state countries taking orders from Brussels. We don't want a European Defence Union. What Trump should say is that we want NATO, and you choose NATO and nothing else. And that would put paid to Starmer's attempt to take us into the EDU, which he's desperately trying. Every time he flies off to Germany to talk about military cooperation, intelligence cooperation, He was in Poland this week doing the same thing. What Starmer is actually doing is taking steps towards handing over British military to Brussels. And that's precisely what it is. It might sound a bit scaremongering to say it, but that's what he's doing. And I think Trump should, as a condition of continued protection of the United States and its participation in NATO, he should make any moves towards an EDU unacceptable. The other thing I think he should do is make it a requirement of the membership of NATO that NATO members enforce their borders. What greater threat can there be to a NATO member than its borders not being enforced? So I think in the case of the European Union, he should require member states to re-erect their borders in the way that Germany is already beginning unilaterally to do. He should require the British government to enforce its borders down the middle of the Channel, and also to enforce its border on the island of Ireland, removing the ridiculous Irish Sea border. Trump can do that through NATO. He can say that the natural borders of countries should be observed and enforced, and the unnatural border, that is the Irish Sea border, should be removed. So I think that's the second thing he can do through NATO. The third thing he could do is require that all countries who wish to be members of NATO deport any illegal migrants that they have in their countries or send them to secure detention facilities. It's absolutely in keeping with the protection of peace that people who are illegally in our country and about whom we know nothing should be detained and then deported as soon as possible, if possible. But in the absence of that, should be detained. And if he were to do those two things and require NATO members to enforce their borders and require NATO members to detain and deport those who have entered their country illegally, actually he will bring so much security to the Western world. And it would be absolutely within the remit of NATO to do that. And if member states in NATO push back and say, well, we can't do it because we're all members of this crazy organization called the European Convention of Human Rights and subject to the European Court of Human Rights jurisdiction, well, then he should say, you must leave the ECHR if you wish to be a member of NATO. He can do all these things. And can you imagine how safe we would be as a result of that? We would have borders reinstituted. We'd be spending more money on our military, and our military would not be, as it is being at the moment, I'm absolutely certain of it, handed over to the European Union. Through NATO, Trump can assure the continued peace of Europe, both as far as external threats are concerned, by building up its own military and not allowing a European defence union to take root, and also by requiring NATO member states to enforce their borders. It's simple, and I really hope someone in the White House picks up on this message. And what of the week ahead? Well, the big event is Monday the 20th of January, when President Trump is inaugurated. And from the bottom of my heart, I wish him and his administration all the very best of luck in delivering their agenda. It's vital for Western civilization that President Trump and his team succeed in making America great again, enforcing their borders, deregulating, getting rid of net zero, cutting taxes, and making sure that global trade takes place on a fair basis. And the reason I say that is because if the US succeeds, then we will be able, with confidence in the UK, to follow them. Indeed, we will need to follow them, because if we don't, the resurgent United States will suck away capital and our greatest people to their shores. So in their success will come a change of agenda, I am sure, in the United Kingdom, and I hope across Europe, where countries rediscover the importance and the benefits of their sovereignty, putting their own national interests first, putting their people's interests first, and that we can then cooperate on the international stage as proud, independent equals, not parts of subsumed supranational institutions where democracy is dumbed down, but where we can stand all equally proudly with the interests of our countries firmly in mind when we deal peaceably with each other. Thank you very much, folks, for tuning in to the News at Ben.